1998. Dr. Kona-Boun has worked at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine of the University of Montreal from 2001 to 2010 as a clinician in the service of anesthesiology in small and large animals. He taught veterinary students and did applied clinical research in small and large animals. Since 2011, Dr. Kona-Boun is responsible for the service of anesthesiology in a large private practice, a reference and specialty center for small animals in Montreal. He also does teaching to veterinary students as well as animal health technicians. He also provides continuing education by scientific articles, conferences, formations in the clinics, and phone calls. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jean-Jacques Kona-Boun.
Thank you, Jonathan. So last year, we received a mandate from Professor Roy, Professor Alain Roy, who is a professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Montreal, and who is the person who initiated all the legal process against the rodeo. And the mandate he gave us was to determine if the rodeo activities represent a risk for the safety, for the health and welfare of the animal beings used, to identify and analyze all the situations at risk, irrespective of the frequency and severity of this risk, and to report all the accidents, the injuries, and the clinical signs suggesting the existence of such injuries. The activities evaluated occurred during the summer of 2017 in the Rodeos of Montreal in August and in the Rodeos of the Western Festival of Sentient in September. The activities evaluated were calf roping, steer wrestling, bronc riding, bull riding, as well as the gymkhana activities such as barrel racing, rider exchange, and rescue race. Now about the methodology, it is important to realize that the veterinary clinical report I am presented here has been made by analyzing more than 140 hours of video. And it is even more important to realize that we cannot detect all the problem by just viewing at normal speed. It is very important to analyze all these hours of video at normal speed, but also in slow motion. So I viewed all the videos at 25% of the normal speed, in addition to the normal speed. So you can imagine the time it took. We were 3 observers, and among us were 2 members of SHARK, the association SHARK, showing animals respect and kindness, Steve Indy and Michael Kobliska, who went from Chicago to share their experience and their equipment. And I must say that they were instrumental in the success of this investigation. I took more than 2,600 screenshots so as to illustrate all the problem encountered in the rodeo. 2,600 screenshots, but you have to realize that a screenshot is a still image. So it cannot replace the careful viewing of the videos at normal speed and in slow motion. And some events that are described in the text of the report could not be illustrated with screenshots because it was too fast and it was not possible to take a screenshot. But the videos are evident to see the problems. So I analyzed the video, but also there was another type of evaluation, a direct close evaluation for two categories of performances during the calf roping and the steer wrestling. While the 2 other observers stayed with the public, I went in the enclosure to see the animal beings when they arrived from the performance and to evaluate their health and any clinical sign of injury. This veterinary clinical report is public. It is included in a larger report produced by Professor Alain Roy, which is in the back of the room. And it comprises many other documents, such as hundreds of videos, as well as comments of several international experts. And it is available at the link at the bottom of the screen. Now, the risk of physical injuries from mechanical trauma, categories of performance by category. Of course, I have a limited amount of time, so it is not an exhaustive list. If you want to have all the problems we encountered, you can see the report. Concerning calf roping, a lot of calves were abruptly stopped while they were running at full speed by a sudden traction on their neck, which lifted them in the air and sometimes making them to do a 180 degrees turn in the air. Some calves landed on their feet, but others were violently thrown on the ground and falling on their thorax, on their neck, on their head, or on their back too. Imagine these calves weigh approximately 100 kilograms, and they run at several meters per second. So this translates in a high kinetic energy and an important force applied on the soft and hard tissues of the cervical region when there is a tension, sudden tension on the rope. So it makes the calf abruptly stop while they are running fast. Some screenshots were done with a perfect timing. It's not possible to see at normal speed, but you can see the severe deformation of the neck. This severe deformation of the neck caused by the strangulation when the calf is abruptly stopped while it is running at full speed. And it's evident that it's a high risk of injury of the vertebral structure as well as the spinal cord. Injuries to the vertebral structure, to the spinal cord, but also to the skin, to the muscles, to the peripheral nerves, to the respiratory structures of the neck, the larynx, the trachea, the blood vessels. Sometimes the shock on the thorax as well as on the head could cause intrathoracic damage and intracranial damage if the calf is thrown violently on the ground. Many times, the rope was placed not on the neck, but directly on the eyes of the calves. In some cases, the rope just slid on the eyes, which is enough to cause a damage to the fragile structures of the eyeball and the eyelids. However, in other cases, the rope was abruptly taut strongly enough to lift the calf in the air while it was still on the eyes. We can see here the violent flexion imposed by the rope on the neck of the calf while it is running at full speed, and the rope is on the eyes. So in addition to the damage possible on the vertebral structure or on the cervical structure, there is a high risk of damage to the eyeballs and to the eyelids. Sometimes, well, often, the calves were lifted by the cowboys who pulled on the rope to throw them on the ground. And in some cases, while they were lifting suddenly, abruptly, violently, the rope was on the eyes. So it was an additional risk of injuries of the cornea, laceration, perforation, intraocular pressure can increase a lot and cause damages. Remember, these animal beings weigh approximately 100 kilograms. So imagine the sudden force you have to exert on the rope so as to lift them. Imagine if it is applied, the force is applied on the eyes. It happened a few times. Even after the throwing to the ground and the tying up of the legs, sometimes the rope stayed on the eyes. So it represented an additional risk of ocular and palpebral injuries, particularly if the horse maintained a tension on the rope. So it happened a few times when the horse was applying a tension on the rope, and sometimes the horse moved, so it dragged the calf in the sand over a few meters, sometimes with the rope in the neck, but sometimes with the rope in the eyes. And this risk of ocular and palpebral injury caused by the rope was ubiquitous and observed many times, and not only in calves, but also in other categories of animal beings, such as steers and bulls. Of course, there was no activities such as the bull roping, but after the performance of bull riding, when the bulls didn't want to exit by themselves the arena, they were roped so as to guide them to the exit. And many times we saw bulls with the rope on the eye. In calf roping, the head and neck were not the only body parts that possibly damaged by the roping. Several times, the calves were caught by the rope placed on one or two legs, anterior or posterior. This resulted in hyperextension of the affected legs, and sometimes they fell on the ground, and this fall could have caused injuries. The sudden hyperextension of the posterior legs, like in this example, can be associated with risk of injuries to the joint, to the ligament, to the muscles, to the nerves. And there is also an additional risk of hyperextension if the calf collapses and he has no posterior leg to prevent the collapse. So he collapses all his weight on his already hyperextended posterior legs. So it is an additional risk of injuries to the joint, muscles, nerves, and osteoarticular system. Even if the calf did not collapse on his hyperextended posterior leg, because he has another posterior leg to land and to prevent the collapse, there is still a risk of, for example, coxofemoral luxation, hip dislocation. Remember, they are running fast at full speed, and they are abruptly stopped by the rope in hyperextension. Sometimes the anterior leg was caught by the rope. In this case, the calf was running at full speed and was abruptly caught by the rope, and it caused a mechanical stress on the anterior leg because it caused a sudden abduction, and this abduction could have caused injuries to the shoulder, but also injuries to the nerve structure that is located under the shoulder, which is called brachial plexus. It is a typical cause of brachial plexus avulsion, a tearing of the complex nervous structure under the shoulder. The skull was not spared by the risk of mechanical injuries. Some calves, as I said earlier, were abruptly stopped while running at full speed and were thrown to the ground and the impact sometimes was directly on the head. So it was a real risk of cranial trauma and concussion. After the initial strangulation during the process of capture, many calves were strangulated a second time. As I said earlier, usually the cowboy pulls the rope so as to lift the calf in the air before he throws the calf to the ground. But it causes a second strangulation because it is not soft. It is very sudden and strong. So it's like hanging the calf finally. And in several cases, the calves underwent a third type of strangulation, horizontally this time, while they were lying on the ground during or after the tying up of their legs. And it happened when the horse maintained a tension on the rope, which is not supposed to occur. And even sometimes the horse moved and hung the calf, dragged the calf over several meters while he was still strangulated. And also, very often, the calves were lifted in the air and were thrown to the ground, and the impact could be violent on the thorax and on the back. And the abrupt increase in intrathoracic pressure following the impact on the ground could result in damages in the lungs, such as pulmonary contusion. And of course, if the violent impact is on the back, it may cause vertebral injuries. You have to realize that the calves were used several times during the Western Festival of St. Tite. Several times, several days, and sometimes more than once in the same day. So they were exposed many times to various types of mechanical injuries. Steer wrestling. The essence of this performance is to cause an abrupt cervical torsion so as to destabilize the steer and make him fall, because a steer can weigh 300 kilograms, so you cannot make him fall just by applying a pressure on the back. You have to cause a loss of balance, and the way to do that is to jump on him while you are on horseback. You jump on him, and you do a brutal, violent, sudden torsion of the neck. So the trauma of the neck and the risk of injuries of the various cervical structure, it is inherent to this performance. Most of the time, the cervical torsion reaches 180 degrees in a fraction of a second. So it is an extreme torsion realized very quickly because it needs to be quick, because it is a sudden loss of balance that allows to make these heavy animals fall. So it is a constant risk of cervical injuries, notably vertebral and spinal. The steers were used for other types of performance, not only steer wrestling. And in other types of performances, they were roped. And sometimes they were caught by one or two posterior legs. So it is the same risk as I discussed earlier for the calves. Hyperextension or collapse, all his weight on his legs. If the two posterior legs were in hyperextension, there is a risk of injury. And as I said for the calves, the steers were used several times, several days during the festival, and sometimes more than once in the same day. So also they were exposed many times to various types of risks of injuries. Bronc riding, saddle and bareback. The problem, many problems, but one problem is the violent and frenetic bucking. And it was often uncoordinated, and it represented a risk of injuries for the horses for several reasons. Contrary to what people may say or believe, the horses are not always in total control of their movement when they are bucking. And they are not always fully aware of their surrounding, immediate surrounding. Frenetic bucking could result in fall. So, of course, when a horse, a heavy animal is falling, there is a risk of injuries in the legs, the neck, the head, as in this example, when the horse fell on his head. As an anesthesiologist, I fear the fall in a horse. And I have seen directly and indirectly fractures in horses when they were recovering from anesthesia in the recovery box. And so a horse who falls has a risk of injury on the legs, but also on the neck and the head. And it is not a soft fall in this case. And the cowboy never recovered. He never stood up, but it was his choice. Another type of risk, in case of bad landing, because they are bucking frenetically, they jump, not always in a coordinated way, but imagine when a force is exerted by several hundreds of kilograms, amplified by the velocity of the jump, and all this force exert a pressure on two or sometimes just one leg who bears all the pressure exerted by all this weight. There is a risk of fracture, particularly if the angle between the leg and the ground is not appropriate. I have seen that directly and indirectly in horses who recovered from anesthesia and who were not coordinated. Another type of risk, as I said, it is not always coordinated, and they are not always fully aware of their immediate surrounding. And in many cases, there was a risk of collisions with obstacles, such as barriers and gates. Accidents, sometimes fatal, has been described in horses who run in barriers or in walls in a rodeo because they were just they were not aware of what happened around them, and they just ran in the wall, and one died last year. Not in this rodeo, but when you see the videos of the rodeo where the horse died and the video we took where many horses nearly hit the wall, it is exactly the same. There is no difference. Whatever the norms they can have here, or the animals, they do not read the norm. They jump, they buck, and sometimes they hit a wall, and it can be fatal. Another example where the horse nearly hit the wall. Another risk, and this risk caused the most spectacular accident in the festival last year. It was in the saddle bronc performance. Many times, the horses, after the cowboy had been ejected, the horses stepped on the rope that was hanging from their halter to the ground. This created a sudden tension on the rope, and this caused an abrupt flexion of the neck. Imagine you are bucking, you are jumping, you are running, and you step on the rope that is attached on your chin, on the halter. It caused a violent flexion. I tried once just to see what it does, and it was blank for a fraction of seconds. So you have injuries. You can cause injuries, whiplash, injuries of the cervical spinal cord, but also a concussion. So it happened many times in this category of performance. Sometimes the horse lose his balance and fall. So once again, there is a risk associated to the fall, risk of injuries to the head, to the neck, to the leg, to the legs. But in one case, the horse was not fortunate. So the white horse, it was a mare, big sky, and it is another perfect timing for a screenshot, because when we were during the performance, we did not understand what happened. We just saw the mare fall. But after viewing carefully at slow motion, screenshot sequence by sequence, we saw that. And she stepped on the rope. She had a violent hyperflexion of the neck. And immediately, it is impressive when you see the video, immediately she fell on the ground, and she showed signs of seizures, spasms, defecation, and during several minutes, she stayed on the ground. So she certainly had some type of concussion, or probably also spinal cord, cervical spinal cord damage. After a few minutes, the mare stood up, but she walked, but she was very unstable. And she fell again after only a few meters. And this time, at the second fall, the impact on the head was very violent, more violent than previously, which created a serious risk of second head trauma. After she stood up for the second time, the mare was still very unstable. And she stepped again several times on the same rope that was hanging from the halter. So repeating each time a risk of doing the same accident. Bull riding is approximately the same problem as I told for the bronc riding. So there is a problem, a risk associated with the violent and frenetic bucking, often uncoordinated. And as I said for the horses, the bulls are not always in total control of their movement, are not always fully aware of their immediate surrounding. These are very heavy animal beings, even heavier than the horses. So a fall is not a minor problem. It can be disastrous. As I said for the horses, in case of bad landing, you have several hundreds of kilograms exerting a pressure on two or even sometimes just one leg that touches the ground initially. So if the leg has not a good orientation relatively to the ground, or if, as we saw many times with the bulls, if there is a torsion while the bull is landing, if he rotates the leg, it can also create a problem, an injury of the skeleton. Between December and March, 3 bulls fractured their legs, not at this festival, but in other rodeos. But you see, if you compare the videos, it's exactly the same. No matter the norms that say the so-called norms they have in sentient, the bulls, they do not read the norms. They just jump and buck, and sometimes we are lucky, but sometimes an accident happened. And when you see the videos, particularly of one of the bulls, it was in New Zealand or Australia, I don't remember, a few months ago, it was not violent, even less violent than many we saw in sentient. He was just exiting the bucking chute, jumping a little, and the leg was like that after. So it can happen. You do not need a violent jump, just a bad orientation of the leg with several hundred kilograms above, and it can break. It is a misconception to believe that they are more powerful, they are more heavier, but it is just, the problem is it is because they are heavy. They are heavy, and it's a problem to their safety in such activities. The bulls were not always aware of their surroundings. Then, as we saw with the horses, sometimes they collide with, there was a risk of collision with obstacles, such as barrier gates. In this case, the bull, usually they exit the bucking chute, they walk a few meters, and they start to buck. But in this case, he started immediately to buck. So he was turning around himself, passing many times very close to the gate. He could have collided with the gate. And in fact, it happened with another bull who collided, and the collision was so violent that he was thrown to the ground. The gymkhana performances, the soft part of the rodeo. But there was still a risk. And the risk in the gymkhana performances was because it is a timed event. So it is a speed. Speed is a factor. And the risk was associated with falls and collisions with obstacles because the animal beings were running fast and doing very tight turns. In every gymkhana performance that we saw, there was a turn, one or many turns. And these turns were very tight, particularly in the barrel racing, and done at high speed. So, for example, in the barrel racing, the collisions with the barrels were frequent. But the problem is in the collision first, but also if the barrel falls, it becomes an obstacle for the horse. And the horse can stumble on the barrel and fall. And it happens sometimes, and injure themselves because they are falling on this obstacle. In addition to making obstacles that could make the horse fall and sustain injuries, the barrels could also lacerate the skin or damage, for example, the eyes by the friction on their edge if the horse stumble or fall. And the edge of the barrel doesn't need to be cutting to be traumatic. A blunt trauma on the skin or on the eye is enough to cause damage. During the barrel racing, barrels were not the only obstacle with which the horses could collide, but once again, too tight turns at too high speed. Sometimes the horse just missed the turn and he almost ran in the gate, or in the wall, if the turn was missed. Even without collisions, some horses stumbled in the very tight turns, and because they were running fast. We can see on this horse, there is a serious risk. He's falling on the edge of the barrel, just under the eye. There is a risk of injury. But sometimes they did not just stumble, they fell. And when I see the position and the orientation of his anterior leg, there is a risk. There is a serious risk of fracture. You do not need to have an open fracture to have lesions. Many lesions cannot be visible externally. The fact that you do not see something bleeding or an open fracture externally does not mean that there is no internal injury. This is another simplistic way to evaluate the state and the health of an animal. In the exchange and rescue races, same problem. So it consisted in high speed, in tight turns, less tight than in the barrel racing, but still enough to make many horses stumble and fall. The risk of injuries were related to the excessive flexions or extensions of the legs when they stumble or when they fall. So we can see the extreme hyperextension that can be aggravated if the horse collapses on his already hyperextended legs. When they are running fast in tight turns, the horses are in a situation of vulnerability because they are not always stable. And the problem is when a cowboy tried to jump to mount the horse while the horse is in this situation of vulnerability, instability. It can cause a fall. For me, a fall in a horse who is running, it's a risk. A few slides, not because it is not important, but because I am running out of time. Psychological distress. We cannot ignore and focus only on the somatic or physical suffering. A lot of animal beings showed various signs of psychological distress. For example, in the bovine, the rolling of the eyes. We saw that many times in calf roping, the rolling of the eyes when you just see the white part of the eye. It is a characteristic sign associated with possible psychological distress, but not just the babies, also the adults. We saw that on bulls, particularly bulls who panicked, literally panicked in the bucking chute. Another sign possibly associated with psychological distress was defecation that we see on at least one calf while he was lying on the ground at the end of the roping performance. As I said, some animal beings literally panicked in the chute. For example, this steer, it is a little dark, so we do not see, but he was trying to jump, to escape from the chute. And he caught his leg between the two parts of the door in front of him. So it added a physical risk of injury if he was jumping or agitated. He was agitated while his leg was caught in the two parts of the door in front of him. Some horses panicked also in the bucking chute, making violent attempt to avoid the manipulation of the cowboy. It's a screenshot. It is much more impressive when you see the video, and it's even more impressive when you are just next to the horse, because I was next to all these animals just above the bucking chute. He was trying to jump out of the bucking chute. I don't know if he was an athlete, but he did not seem to appreciate the performance. Panic in the bucking chute was also observed in bulls. Some of them made also violent attempts to avoid the repeated manipulation of the cowboy, and one tried to jump out of the chute. It is very impressive. Imagine you are just standing next to this bull, and he was also, half of his body was outside of the chute, and he was desperately trying to flee, to run away. In the case of this bull, I remember he panicked violently during several minutes. During several minutes, the cowboys tried to put their equipment on him, tried to mount him. 3 days later, the same bull was used again. And he did exactly the same violent reaction during several minutes. It does not seem to be the same bull, but it is the same because the luminosity was not exactly the same as 2 days, but it is the same. And it can be recognized by his characteristic and abnormalities on the horn. And also another typical characteristic that you do not see, but on his ear, there was a injury. So this bull was used twice at 2 days, in spite of his violent panic the first day. So he should not have been used the second time, or he should not have been used any time, as all the other animals. Conclusion: all the evaluated rodeo activities were associated with at least one or more risk for the welfare and the safety of the animal beings. Of course, the risk varied in frequency. All the categories of performance were not equal. Some of them were more problematic. And in some activities, the risks were important, but also constant. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation, quite disturbing, Jean-Jacques Kona-Boun. And we're going to have a brief Q&A for Dr. Kona-Boun regarding his presentation. So if anybody has some questions, and we have some distinguished guests who are taking seats at the front. I'm not sure who they are, so I can't introduce them, but maybe they can introduce themselves. And so if I can ask you to, before you speak, if somebody asks you a question, if you could just briefly introduce who you are, that would be great. I know at least, well, maybe you've all been here earlier this week, but we might not know who you are. So questions?
Before you take the questions, since we have little time, let the three panelists make some comments directly, and then we'll go to the audience.
Okay. We'll start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kona-Boun. You. My name is Alain Roy. I'm professor at the Faculty of Law at University of Montreal. What's about the argument of the industry that horses and bulls are athletics and they love to perform, that they want to do these activities?
So the animal beings used in the rodeo are athletes. Oh, you are talking about the calves? Are you talking about the calves? Or because they always forget to talk about the babies and the teenagers. So I am not sure that the calves are trained to perform. Concerning the adults, maybe they are selected genetically to be more efficient, to jump and to buck, but it does not make them love what they say, what they do. And most important, it does not remove the risk. So no matter what they like to do, the risk is still there. So the fact that they are athletes or not is not so important for us. According to the law, if there is a risk, earlier, I talked about the cowboy who did not recover after the fall of the horse. He was probably an athlete, but it shows what he did. I perform karate. I have been performing karate for 30 years. I have made a lot of competition. I have sustained a lot of injuries, fracture, contusion, concussion, but I knew what I was doing. I knew what to expect. I chose to do it. The horse whatever his status of athlete, or he does not choose. So, and the risk is still present. So it's not an argument for me.
About the risk, do you think that if you could make an exam after the performance, you could see some lesions, some injuries on the animal?
Injuries, no, because as I said, unless it is an extremely severe injury, bleeding, fracture, you will not necessarily see injuries. But you will see clinical signs. But be careful. The fact that you do not see external signs of injury does not mean that there is no internal lesions. And it is oversimplistic. And remember too that they are under the influence of epinephrine, adrenaline, and many signs can be masked for a long time during and after the performance. But in spite of that, I saw, particularly in calves and steers, I saw clinical signs such as limping or coughing. And, but unfortunately, we were not allowed to push the physical exam and the evaluation of the animals. But just one simple example. I would be very interested to do a very simple test that we call Fluorescein Test, which is a test that can help to detect a defect in the cornea. And if we do this test on the calves after calf cropping, probably you would be surprised. Not me, I would not be surprised because I expect a lot of corneal injuries. Just a simple example. It's simple to do, it is not expensive, but unfortunately we did not have the authorization to do that. So do not conclude that there is no injury because you do not see external signs, and even clinical signs can be masked for sometimes after the performance. So,
thank you for your presentation, Nicolas Morello, Droit Animal du Québec, Quebec Animal Law. Just for some context, it was Professor Roy who instigated the lawsuit and who was successful in obtaining a court order, to be able to have access to the rodeo. And it would appear that it's the first time in the world that there's been unfettered access to a rodeo. I'd like to make a comment more than a question. As a lawyer, I understand fully the human beings that participate in this activity, and I'll explain what I mean. For 400 years in Quebec, animals were classified as property. And what that meant was that you could use and dispose of the property as you deemed fit. You could destroy the property, you could damage the property, and it was entirely legal. Just over 2 years ago, the Animal Welfare and Safety Act came into effect in Quebec. And so there's a new legal framework with respect to the images that you saw. And it's my understanding that Professor Roy is of the opinion, as am I, that these activities are now illegal under the new law. What's important to understand under the new law is that animal beings are now classified, are specifically excluded from being property or things. So it's unequivocal. The law says that animal beings are sentient. It says that they have biological needs, and it talks about 3 types of biological needs: physical, physiological, and behavioral, all of which Dr. Kona-Boun has demonstrated in the evidence that he's collected. I just want to give some context to how all of this video came into effect, and the Quebec ministry responsible for application of the Act, the Animal Welfare and Safety Act, is currently taken under advisement all of this information, which was provided to a consultative committee for the government to respond with a position if these activities are legal or illegal under the new legal framework. Thank you.
I have That sounds amazing. That's hopefully good news, or it's going to be good news. I just was thinking about the earlier talk about do cows have an idea about their future, and the example you gave with the saddle, where they tried to put the saddle on this one bull, is actually he knew what was coming. So that's actually a very clear example that they have an idea about their future. I was wondering about the electric shockers, because normally those animals are tame animals, so they would not buck, and the horses just buck because of the strap and the flank strap. And so, did you see the use of electric shockers?
I would not say that they are tamed, partially tamed, because particularly the broncs and the bulls, they are not really tamed. They are not very approachable, and we saw that when we had to do the post-performance exam of the mare that had the concussion. We had to reevaluate her, and it was not very easy to approach her. So, but no, we did not see any use of the electric pods.
Okay,
Yes.
But the strap I saw on the pictures.
Yes, the strap. Yeah. Yes, the strap. The spurs
Yeah.
also. The how do you say whip? Yes, and so the whip, the spurs, the straps, but no signs of. They knew they were observed, and in spite of that, we saw. When you open the eyes and you see carefully, it's like a new world, a new universe. We saw many things. So even if they knew that they were observed, we saw many problems. But no electric pod, no, it's forbidden. But many other things are forbidden. They have norms. So, for example, it is strictly forbidden to, what is the term, jerk off the calves, to lift them so that they are in the air and they fall on their back, it is forbidden. But it happened many times. So, of course, there was penalty for the cowboy, but the calf were happy with that, with the penalty, because it still happened. So the penalty, the norms, they cannot prevent. In every sport, you have penalties. Even if the athletes are doing their best, you have error and mistakes, and the penalties, it will not prevent completely the injuries. So yes, they have norms, and in these norms, electric pods are forbidden, and we did not see this use.
Just one, but also you weren't able to follow up with those animals. You don't know how long they were used and when they went to slaughter, because that's what they normally.
Once the performance was finished, we asked, before the rodeo, we sent a protocol, a suggestion of protocol of evaluation, and we asked to have access after the rodeo to the animals, to their medical record, and it was not accepted.
I'll just add a few more comments about what you said about taming. The fact that these horses, when you actually train a horse to be ridden, the horse will systematically have fear responses to the contact of the girth of the saddle, and you as a trainer, your job is to desensitize that horse gradually to that contact so that it no longer has fear responses or escape responses. The fact that these horses exhibit intense responses to contact and to pressure, my hypothesis is that it's done in two ways. They are selected for that, which is one argument that the other party brought forward. You know, they're trained for that and they're selected for that. True. But the only way you can get such a extreme response is that you actually select horses to be either more sensitive to pressure or to not habituate to relentless pressure. Yeah. And if anything, it makes using these animals less ethical, because they do not habituate to pressure. Yeah. And that's usually problematic. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Dominique. I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa. I work with, my thesis is about New York City carriage horses. And my question is that I applaud your initiative because there really need to be like some progress made in the industry. I'm just not sure that the abolitionist view of saying these activities are illegal and they should be outright dismissed is the way to go. I think that there are many ways to make them more humane, and prohibiting the use of cattle in rodeos could be one of them. But I'm wondering, because there's a lot of ways in which you're kind of not making a case for yourself, where you haven't mentioned any numbers in your talk, and there's risk in everything, but none of that risk has been calculated, like no numbers of occurrences of injury or harm has been presented. And in all of those screenshots, I mean, we don't really know what's going on. So I'm just wondering about like what the outcome is going to be in the future regarding those issues.
Perhaps I can try to answer. The legal framework is not one of numbers. The legal framework is based on a very specific test that talks about providing necessary, preventing the animal being from abuse or mistreatment that may affect their health. So the Act does not say that does affect their health. It says abuse or mistreatment that may affect their health. So the threshold of the test and the trigger of the protection under the Act is very low in Quebec. It hasn't been tested yet. It will probably be tested over in a short period of time. So the legislator didn't take an approach, because I understand what you're saying. There are people that will say that is a numbers game and that is based on risk. And in the law, there is also a test that creates a presumption that if the abuse or mistreatment may affect the health, the owner or the custodian of the animal being, the burden shifts over to them, and they have to come forth and they have to explain why the activity may not affect the health. So it's a new legal framework, a new paradigm that will be tested. We are encouraged here in Quebec with this. Opponents will raise the exact arguments that you have raised, but this study and Dr. Kona-Boun has provided a number of statistics. The Quebec government will go through all of that, and the working group will look at that. But the test is very low. And just to recall that it's based on 3 criteria: biological needs, which are physical, physiological, so there's a distinction between physical and physiological, and behavioral. So we'll see how well the act works, but the test and the threshold is low.
But that's there, and where do you like draw the line of where abuse is? Because then if you're putting barrel racing in those categories, then a lot of equine activities, all around Quebec are, would fall under the same category, under like very subjective premises, and that would like cause prejudice to horses because of their domesticated status and the situation of their integration in the labor system in society. So thank you.
I think my question was just answered. It was about the law and risk and voluntariness. So risks are acceptable when they're voluntary. You've shown these risks are involuntary to most of the animals, but barrel racers, in my experience, love doing that. They want to do that. They'll accept that risk, is the attitude I get from the horse. And it's clear the law is going to outlaw that because that may entail harm to the animal. And so just sort of everyday trail riding is going to be illegal, it looks like.
Can I just add a comment? I think you are correct in saying that some of the questions that have been raised for the rodeo industry are also true for all equestrian disciplines. I think we've come to a point where, to quote Andrew McLean, we have to figure out how we cap the price that horses pay for our own glory and our own pleasure. I would say that there's a totally ethical way to still use horses, but it implies that in order to be ethical, equitation must be very, very difficult for the rider, and it must be very easy on the horse. But I agree that we need data. We're also getting data from other disciplines like dressage, cross-country, show jumping, Western pleasure, running. And yes, totally, some of the questions that have been raised in rodeo also apply to other competitions. And they must be raised, absolutely.
And just to add to that point, under the law, when we talk about abuse or mistreatment, it's important to recall that this is for entertainment purpose. It's not for any utilitarian purpose to help people or for the enjoyment of the animal being. This was designed when horses were property. You could destroy them, you could injure them, and it was entirely legal to do so. And it was entirely legal to sell people tickets to come and to see these events. The new legal framework, in my position, is that this is no longer legal. And when we talk about abuse or mistreatment under the law, specifically here, we're looking at these animal beings that are being subjected to these experiences for entertainment purposes. Yeah, I'm not dismissing the historical link. I think the law dismissed the historical link in 1995 when we broke the 400-year legal paradigm that these horses and these animal beings were property. And I think there's a clear intent behind the legislature to break that link and to create a new legal system that protects the biological needs of these animal beings. 2015.
I was wondering,
Can you say that, ask the question again?
Non, j'entends rien du tout. T'entends ce qu'il dit? J'entends pas ce qu'il dit.
Est-ce qu'il y a une stratégie
Bien. Bye.
be done? Like what can the normal the citizen do to help you?
Oh.
So public outreach and stuff like that.
A strategy to show. Share the information, share the video, share the report, talk to your friend, to your family in a respectable way always, and make a phone call and write to the Ministry of Agriculture, yeah. But always in a pacific and respectable way. But I think that the problem for many people is that they do not know, they don't know, they don't see. Even me, I was surprised to discover many things by checking, by viewing carefully the videos at slow motion. I saw things I did not even imagine. So many people are just not aware of and imagine the public who is watching the performances. They do not see, after the calf has been caught by the rope, they do not see the calf. They see the cowboys, they hear the crowd with so it's easy to miss any problem unless it is a very severe problem. You cannot miss an animal being with an open fracture, but you can miss many types of problem and injuries. So many people are just not aware, and many people could be open if we present to them the problem, but in a respectful way. So share the information on the social media or by any other way. All is public. The report is public. The videos are public, and the comment of the international experts are public. So give the information.
Letter in newspaper are very useful.
Thank you.
And I would just add, just tell people that there's a law. Just tell people that there is a law that these animal beings are no longer property, just for the public to understand that something has changed, that these are sentient beings, and that there is a clear intention by all of Quebecers to treat these animal beings in conformity with the law. Just to make that point is very, very useful.
We will just take questions from the people who are being waiting to ask questions, and then we're going to wrap up because we're over 2 hours.
Yes, hi, I'm James. You did mention psychological disorders in animals that take part in those competition. I was just wondering, is there some long-term mental illness in those animals? Do they get more aggressive as they have more competition into them?
Oh, it's not at all my discipline. I cannot say that. I cannot tell. I'm sorry. I'm not a psychologist or a behavioral specialist.
Okay.
If I may add some information, research is going to give us a lot of answers. We've used research methods like cognitive bias. It's been used in cattle, actually, to look, for example, at the effects of some containment systems, management systems, weaning systems, too. And we also have cognitive bias studies actually are coming out on horses. We know that there is a condition similar to depression now in horses, and we have behavioral indicators of depression. And there's a study that was been done by a team of French scientists, ethologists, and it's associated with certain position or lack of responsiveness to horses that are kept in stall. Particularly school horses, because they have very repetitive activities and they're isolated from conspecifics. So we have data coming in. Again, to repeat the question we heard this morning, ask me again in 20 years. My guess is we'll have a lot more information about that. But yes, there is an impact on how we use horses and cattle. And that definitely affects welfare in the long term.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So my question is, it works. If we only consider the risks on the health of the animal that the rodeo is causing, even with strong evidence that some activities are causing pain and trauma to the animals, aren't these evidence not sufficient enough to abolish the rodeo and make it illegal? Because what I fear is that people from the rodeo industry could just reform the rodeo so these risks disappear or become very inoffensive, which would make the rodeo legitimate because there are no risks of pain. And let's imagine that they were able to create a medicine that would guarantee that no pain would be felt by the animal and there were no risk of injury. Would it be a good enough argument for the industry to continue the activities? So my question is, how exactly do we wish to make the rodeo illegal with this investigation? And shouldn't we also focus on things that cannot be avoided by the people organizing the rodeos, like something that is inherently wrong with the rodeo, like maybe related to justice or concepts of dignity, right to self-property, and the notion of consent of the animal. So there are no compromises that can be made by the industry.
That's a very, very good question. The options that the Quebec legislator has at the end of the consultative process is they can say, one, there is no problem, and we're not going to do anything about it. Two, they can decide to pass regulations which would define what is permitted and what is prohibited. Three, they could decide to implement codes of practice, which are legal general guidelines on the activities. Four, the government can, under the Act, decide to restrict or outlaw the activity, either restrict the activity according to a particular geographical region or restrict the activity to a group of individuals or declare that it is just illegal. So what will happen is the Quebec government has to make a legal decision. They have to say out of those options what they will do, what they won't do. And once they make a legal decision, then we will take the decision of the government and we will validate with what the law says. And if we are of the opinion that the government's decision does not match up with the requirements of the law, then there would be an application in court to ask the court to correct the decision by the government. So it is a long process, but this law gives us as lawyers and jurists the opportunity to review the activities of the rodeo and other activities, which was absolutely impossible before the new law came into effect in December 2015.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll take the last question and please try to make it brief.
It's more of a comment than a question. I was surprised to hear earlier animals not being part of the workplace anymore, wherein for the rodeos, my understanding is they're not domesticated. In fact, the less they are, the better they are for performance. But if they were a member of the workplace, then they would be protected for injuries at work. So maybe we should compensate them and penalize their owners for bad care. You know, like CSST gets higher when they have more accidents in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And since money is, well, what they care about, they would probably take more care of those animals.
Another portion. It's not too bad.
Does anybody want to comment on that? If not, we'll wrap it up. Okay. Well, I want to thank the presenters tonight and also just commend the local effort to expose the rodeo for what it is. It's really impressive, and I don't know if there's any precedent for that, but as somebody who believes in the rights of animals, I, for one, am very grateful. Thanks all for participating, and thanks very much. Please thank the panelists and the presenters.